Good afternoon, Eagle Crest faculty and staff. This is Karen, and I'm here to talk about our Inclusive Excellence series. This time for our series, we're going to look at supporting our students and making sure that we are paying attention to our language so that we can support every single student in our school. Some things to know when we talk about students with disabilities, that really we need to understand, number one, that a student with a disability is absolutely not at all defined by that disability. In fact, in the United States, nearly 20% of the population has some kind of disability, making it the largest minority group in the country. That group will also represent every single other group that exists. So you'll see that show up in gender, you'll see it show up in race, in socioeconomic status, and many others. At our school specifically, we have approximately 18% of our students who have some kind of disability. The big thing today that we want to focus on is making sure that we understand what People First language. People First language is about us as educators recognizing our students first, and then the things they're interested in or enjoy, followed by the disability. So when we're talking about People First language, really we want to put the emphasis on our student, not something that describes them. So when I'm talking about students, for example, I might say person X is a person with a congenital disability instead of that student has a birth defect. So even though I put the disability before or after the person, really the way that we term that, instead of saying a congenital disability, saying birth defect, it actually has much more of a negative connotation. Some other examples might be a person with autism instead of an autistic student, a person with multiple sclerosis instead of suffers from multiple sclerosis. Again, the big key here is understanding how just a slight change in language can impact the way that somebody that we're interacting with sees what we're talking about. We really need to be clear on our unintentional negative impact on language. I just gave a couple of examples, but there really are many others that we might not even realize are having an unintended negative consequence. So for example, we never want to use the language confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. That language really does indicate that the person in the wheelchair is unable to do anything without the wheelchair, which we know is just not the case. In fact, just a couple of years ago, we saw one of our students who was in a wheelchair and had been told he wasn't going to be able to walk at graduation. So we really want to be clear that what we're looking at and what we're saying is not confined to what we think we know. Other things that we want to think about is that language can change the way that our students interact with us and the way that they learn from us. We might unintentionally reinforce stereotypes or prejudices by the way that we say something. And we also want to make sure that we're modeling for our entire student body the language that we expect them to be using. In terms of students at Eagle Crest, we will see students at our school who have autism or Asperger's. We have several students at our school who have Down syndrome. We have some students who've been identified with a congenital disability. We have multiple students with speech or language impairments. We do have a couple of students who have visual impairments. We have students with cognitive disabilities, and we have many students with emotional disabilities. And every single one of these students we may see in a mainstream class, which is why we really want to ensure that everybody in the building is trained to understand what People First language means. For us, it's really about setting the right example. So for years, if you think about the movies that we used to watch or the things that we've seen on TV, we know that the media has not portrayed people with disabilities in the right light. Often they're portrayed as someone who is always in need of help, or they might be portrayed as a person who needed to be shown pity. Other examples, you might have seen a person with a disability who is seen as repulsive. I think that the best example that kind of came up was how we saw The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And we also might see somebody who has a disability as the heroic individual who overcame tragedy, when in reality, the majority of people with disabilities are just like everybody else. So anybody who doesn't have an identified disability. Our job is really just to help change that image, and that's really what we want to focus on at the start of the school year this year. So in the classroom, what you need to be aware of is just to get to know people first. And that will help you really implement the idea of people first language. Get to know all of your students for what they like, enjoy, and what they are all good at doing. And so it's not necessarily something that you're singling out specific students so that you can appropriately use this kind of language. Don't be afraid to correct mistaken language. We know that our students are going to still use certain language because of how they've heard it growing up, because of what they either hear in the home or they've heard in the media. And so we need to make sure that we're willing to correct our students too in their use of language. And then we also want to make sure that we're constantly challenging every single student to learn at his or her highest level. And I think that's really the biggest thing when we talk about inclusive excellence at Eagle Crest, is that we understand the key things that help us get to that place. The biggest thing, again, remember, always put the student first, not the disability, and that's really when you'll have mastered people first language. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you guys again about inclusive excellence.